Okay, welcome. Hello and welcome everyone to the fifth webinar in the Nils Klim Webinar Series. Um, this time on possibilities for queer perspectives when talking about transitional justice and settler states. This series, before we start, I should say that this series is financed by the Nils Klim Prize. It's organized together with the ERC-funded MARCEN project. The webinar is recorded and will be published online on the MARCEN website and also on YouTube. And today, I am very, very happy and honored to have with us here today Dr. Billy-Ray Belcourt, who is a poet, scholar, and author from the Driftball Cree Nation in Northwest Alberta, Canada. He is Associate Professor in the School of Creative Writing at the University of British Columbia. And Dr. Belcourt is the author of 6 books and also serves as the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Cultural Production, in queer Indigenous Cultural Production, sorry. Through his work, Belcourt strives towards helping create institutional spaces for queer Indigenous writing and theorizing. Welcome, Dr. Belcourt. My
Hello.
name is, hello, my name is Daniela Alaattinoğlu. I'm an associate professor of law at the University of Turku and also the principal investigator of the MARCEN project. Questions by the audience can be asked in the chat. There may be time for a few questions in the end of this webinar. And when asking questions, please be mindful and respectful of others. So, Dr. Belcourt, it's, as I said, it's an honor to have you with us here today to address this very important topic on queer perspectives on transitional justice and settler states. So I was wondering if to start, if you could maybe tell us a bit about what does a queer perspective add to our understanding of transitional justice in settler states, which might be missing from more mainstream approaches.
Yeah, such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for convening this important conversation. I suppose I'll begin by acknowledging that the Canada Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the process that involves various sort of public initiatives, uh, uh, you know, deep work that was carried out by Indigenous people here in Canada, as well as non-Indigenous people, aimed at the problem of addressing the violence, specifically of the residential school system, which involved the displacement of Indigenous children into state and church run schools that saw, you know, decades of violence unleashed inside them. And so I think that this system, the residential school system, had other iterations across the world, in the US, in Scandinavia, um, and elsewhere. But in Canada, it first, so the sort of public attention was first drawn to it when one man, Phil Fontaine, obviously this was sort of a key moment, not the first moment, but a key moment in Canadian history when an Indigenous person had positioned himself as a survivor of this system, which required the public at large to change or to take on a different kind of language to make sense of what it meant for that system to exist and to have been government endorsed. And I think since that moment, we've seen various apologies from various governments and governmental representatives. And then the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which released its final report in the winter of 2015. So we can trace this certain historical trajectory in Canada, and I think we're far enough away from that final report, but I'm getting ahead of myself, I think. Anyways, so yeah, just trying to set this sort of historical context. And I think, from my point of view now, the sort of already over a decade removed from that final report, I was still an undergrad when that report was released, so I was not in any way meaningfully involved in any of the processes. But of course, I have relatives, my grandfather, my great grandmother, etc., who were forced to attend these schools and who engaged in the compensation process. So there was a sort of fiduciary component to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But it was, I think, clear to me as early as 2015, and has since become incredibly clear that, queer perspective, trans, indigenous, and two-spirit perspectives were not substantively engaged. And I think this is most evident in the fact that the entire, it's a sort of, Canada put out a 5-volume report on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And as far as I'm aware, there's only one small section where two-spirit people are explicitly addressed. And I'll just quickly read that section because I think it's illuminating. It says, Aboriginal people traditionally celebrated people who were gay or transgender as gifted, as being the recipients of, quote, two spirits. The residential schools had particular impacts upon two-spirited people who faced numerous attacks on their identities. One two-spirited survivor explained that few of the two-spirited students that were at the Hobbema, Alberta school, which is in central Alberta, have lived to tell their stories. Some went to the streets, he says, and most of them died very early, at least 2 by suicide. He stated, and I quote, I've heard through the years that the residential school made people homosexual. Nothing could be further from the truth. Residential school made institutional homosexuals true, but it did not create who we are as two-spirited people, because that who we are was there way before we went in, end quote. He also commented on what he saw as the particular vulnerability of two-spirited people in residential schools. He goes on to say, you might as well put a woman into a man's prison. You're left as a target. For me to survive to be 62, it's a miracle for me. But for the first 10 years after leaving that school, there was a lot of things that went on and I never went home, end quote. So there's a lot of complicated and important topics that are gestured to, both in the survivor's testimony, but also in how the writers of the report sort of contextualize it. And it seems such a missed opportunity in me to engage with much of that. And it also demonstrates, like, we're being asked to take the survivor's testimony as truth at face value, which I think we should. And he's sort of pointing to the intensity of the violence that was experienced specifically as homophobic and transphobic. And so that suggests to me that there should have been a more substantial component to the TRC process that
Mm,
addressed those things and that try to track and generate data about it. Again, we have another gesture in that testimony about how, it could be possible through interviews, through various qualitative methods to actually track, what happened to the students of these schools who identified or continue to identify as Two-Spirit, LGBTQ, and so on. Um, yeah, so I think I can say that in response to the question, it's hard for me to even uh, it's hard to visualize exactly what it would look like to sort of centralize queer and trans and two-spirit perspectives in transitional justice because it did not occur, in my opinion, in Canada.
mm, mm. Thank you very much for that, and also for reading um, this testimony,
Hmm.
which I think is really, even though in its sort of singular form, it is still very powerful. But
Hmm.
what you describe as a missed opportunity, I think, is very pertinent, and of course, important questions. That you also pose, that what would it have meant um, to include queer perspectives in a more systematic way in the
Hmm.
TRC.
Hmm.
My question to you would be in the context of the Canadian TRC.
Hmm.
We talked well, you mentioned this example, but um, uh, what do you think that the TRC did it enable or limit possibilities for queer and indigenous justice? It seems to me that it largely excluded these voices based on the testimony, but I'm wondering if you could maybe develop this a bit further.
Yeah, my sense, and of course, this is only, um, I don't know for sure, but my sense is that individual cases of uh, homophobia, transphobia, etc., might have been addressed during that individual sort of uh, compensation process. So
Mm,
when survivors would have sort of testified to their experience, these these forms of oppression likely would have been uh, vocalized and then addressed and compensated for. But of course, the survivor testimony are sort of private, and unless they've been publicized, I can't say that for sure. But that's my assumption. Um, and it was likely also the case that in during the public hearings, so there were public gatherings across the country in which there were occasions for survivors to discuss their experiences and for the community at large to come together in the hope of healing or in the with the hope of creating more stable ground to discuss the traumatic history. I'm assuming I did not attend any myself, but I'm assuming that those experiences would also have been addressed there. Um, but because there was no sort of mechanism within the TRC itself, which is evident through the omission of queer and trans and two-spirit perspectives largely in that sort of 5 volume report, as well as so Canada put forward, the TRC Commission put forward 94 calls to action, and these address issues that relate to education, healthcare, um, infrastructure, so on and so forth.
mm,
None of those 94 calls to action address, yeah, or uh, express the particularities of queer and trans, indigenous, and two-spirit experience. And again, I think there could have been at least one. We could have gone up to 94 calls to action. If something could have said to the effect of, Canada will, um, make an effort to. It could have been like something like generate data about,
mm,
what the specific experience of two spirit and queer and trans indigenous people was in this system, or to to name, I think it's also important, this could have been a space to name the fact that queer and trans, indigenous, and two-spirit people continue to be, according to the researcher Alex Wilson, who I believe just retired, but she was at the University of Saskatchewan, also Cree. And yeah, according to her research, queer and trans indigenous youth in particular experience probably the most intense forms of subjugation or
Mm.
social oppression among any category in Canada. So this could have been an occasion to name that and to think about, as a country, why that is the case and what kind of measures can be put in place to try to address it. And that subjugation makes, is occurs in the form of uh, everything from suicidal ideation, mental health issues, which is exacerbated by the lack of infrastructure for healthcare at large in many First Nations communities, and the sort of loneliness and social isolation that can emerge in these rural contexts, remote contexts in some cases, and yeah, there could have been a meaningful engagement with that reality in that 94, in those calls to action.
Thank you. Yes, I think that these reflections also speak very much to sort of um, a reoccurring theme, both within this webinar series, but also in when talking about transitional, transformative justice, that
Hmm.
what is recognized in the truth-telling process is then of course, intimately connected then to the redress and reparations afterwards, and what is excluded, of course, from the recognition process and the truth can also not really take a meaningful place in the reconciliation process. And I think that your thoughts, at least for me, that really reflects those perspectives, that
Hmm.
this is sort of an exclusion that has well that matters both in terms of recognition and redress. Um, I was wondering if apart from this testimony that you mentioned
Hmm.
earlier, are there any other particular stories or dynamics within the TRC process in Canada that illuminate the importance of queer perspectives?
I was trying to find things and I could not. I did also sort of my lack of finding anything was validated by another UBC researcher, graduate student, Allison James. Her PhD is on uh, gender and the TRC.
Mm-hmm.
And she notes in her dissertation that there was a complete lack of any data to draw on to contend with gender diversity and sexuality as it pertained to the residential school system.
Mm.
And she writes in her dissertation, and I quote, "The TRC's attention to gender diversity and sexuality in its program and in the final report was so minimal that there was not enough material to analyze thoroughly."
Mm.
End quote. And I think in the memoir and fiction that survivors have published throughout the 20th and into the 21st century, we can likely find either directly autobiographical or even sort of fictional context in which to begin to sort of marshal more data or evidence.
Mm.
And though I don't know of an explicitly two-spirit or queer LGBTQ account of the residential school system in the form of either memoir or fiction, from people who survived that
Mm.
system. I think I have begun to think in my own work as a fiction writer about
Mm.
how to attend to some of this, because we know in academic, in indigenous studies, we've sort of been discussing this issue for a while, and it's quite clearly established in the literature that the residential school system further imposed a system of normative gender and sexuality that relegated queer and trans individuals and two-spirit people to a sort of state of non-being, and that expressions of gender diversity are quote unquote, what the sort of the educators would have seen as a quote unquote expression of sort of gender deviance, that these were marked for correction and often in violent ways. And so what was being fashioned in these schools was the Euro-Canadian national subject that made sense within the frame of compulsory heterosexuality that had been imported from Europe,
Mm.
and that it sort of is clear that these schools functioned as kind of incubators of that Euro-Canadian heteronormative subject. And so perhaps there could be an occasion for the sort of academic literature, the sort of still burgeoning creative, fictional,
Mm.
and autobiographical literature to meet. And it's hard to imagine that we could at this point sort of, the TRC seems somewhat settled. Like
Mm.
it's no longer sort of open for mediation or transformation. And so the change that would occur in order to address this lack of attention to queer and trans and two-spirit indigenous people, it would be retroactive, and it would have to, I think, occur in some other institutional form. And I hope it does occur here
Mm.
in Canada. I'm not sure how exactly it would look.
Mm. Thank you for those thoughts and reflections. And
Hmm.
it's interesting also when reflecting on the Canadian experience, as you say, it's
Hmm.
also sort of dates further back than the other examples that we've been mainly discussing in this webinar series. And the MARCEN project also focuses on the Sami Truth and Reconciliation
Hmm.
Commissions, which are more contemporary, or sort of taking place even as we speak. Also, when does a TRC end? So I thought that was interesting that you also highlighted that there is a sense
Hmm.
of that the TRC process has been closed, and that's actually something that also um, uh, Laila Susanne Vars brought up last webinar, talking about that the truth and reconciliation process should really ideally be ongoing
Hmm.
constantly and sort of be going on. So I guess also that this kind of reimagining what truth and reconciliation could look like can also be part of the aftermath of a TRC. You mentioned also sort of your own work, and I'm now also wondering about this and more specifically about the role of literature.
Hmm.
And storytelling, and so you mentioned your work, but I'm also wondering sort of maybe you can give some examples from your work or more broadly on how or what role literature and storytelling can play in imagining forms of justice that can go beyond what legal or institutional frameworks may offer.
Hmm. So I'm I've been doing a bit of work myself recently on what it might mean to rethink the concept of the literary imagination as something that is put to use in anti-colonial theorizing and writing. And I've looked at, so Martha Nussbaum, the philosopher, she has a book from the 90s called Poetic Justice, The Literary Imagination in Public Life. And in that book, she says that the literary imagination is a public imagination that shapes how we understand proper ethical and moral conduct. And she argues that this is most expressive in the uh, form of the novel, in that the novel has historically made a unique contribution to how we imagine what it is to live uh, the life of other people.
Mm,
And she says that the literary imagination is dependent on emotional experiences of connection and empathy with a possible life or a possible world. And I think this is really generative when put in relationship with a, a project like decolonization or imagining other possible worlds for Indigenous people in the aftermath of, state sanctioned oppression. And it seems to me that the apparatus of reconciliation as it took place in Canada didn't actually invite Canadians to think about the kinds of worlds that Indigenous peoples wanted to live in.
mm,
And that instead it insisted that the current world was the most viable option, which to Indigenous peoples is um, simply a less violent but still colonial state.
mm,
And I think that literature and storytelling have been the methods by which Indigenous people and communities have held on to belief in the possibility of other ways of living and being. Because literature, the literary imagination, as I see it, requires us to suspend some of our belief in the present.
mm,
And that invites us, I think, to think outside the normative spheres of politics and social life.
mm,
And then in my work in particular, sort of, and in my teaching, I teach in creative writing. I've tried to, well, of course, I'm interested in like attending to violence that has gone under discussed or has been repressed in some way to demonstrate the sort of psychic uh, toll of that repression. But I'm also interested in what it means to portray characters in my fiction who understand that, firstly, the state is a settler colonial state, and secondly, who desire ways of being and of being together with other people outside of the structures of colonization that have
mm,
you know shaped everything from our public policy to our social and emotional ties.
mm,
And I gave a talk recently at a university here in Canada in which I suggested it that reconciliation didn't make use of the literary imagination, and that perhaps it should have.
Mm,
and that um, perhaps if Canadians had been encouraged to put to use an interpretive framework that took seriously the desires of like living Indigenous people, that we would have been able to sort of more permanently change the like larger affective fabric
mm,
that is overlaid over the country.
mm. So also about, if I understand you correctly, it's about sort of as a process maybe of well imagining well not just social justice but also the reconciliation and sort of an alternative uh, alternative way of being
Hmm.
and as you point out um, literature and creative writing, yeah, may offer or doesn't necessarily have the same constraints
Yeah.
that institutional or legal frameworks often do have. So thank you for that. Um, if we think about then what the genuinely transformative or what genuinely transformative approaches may look like, or decolonial approaches
Hmm.
to transitional justice may look like um, if queer perspectives were taken seriously. Do you have any thoughts on yeah what they could look like?
Hmm. I think that one of the major issues that we've been confronting in Canada as it pertains to reconciliation is that for many Canadians, it was simply a note of acknowledgement. Like
Mm,
for many, the sort of act of acknowledging that this history took place and that it was uh, destructive and violent was the extent of their engagement with the process. And that has created some friction and tension because reconciliation did importantly introduce a set of policies that are still being put to use and played out in Canada.
mm,
And um, including a sort of wider spread uh, acknowledgement of ongoing Indigenous presence. So there was a period of time in which sort of every institution was in some way engaging with the fact of Indigenous sort of people having ties to the land that predated Canada. This often took the form of land acknowledgements, but there was also sort of deeper and more robust things that happened, various forms of redress. And in the courts right now, and this is causing a great deal of controversy, we in Canada are seeing so this both is related to and not related to reconciliation because again it predates it. But
mm,
in the province I live in now, which is British Columbia, um, there was just a ruling in the fall. The Cowichan Nation was awarded by the uh, BC Supreme Court title to land in a specific area that had and continues to have other leaseholders. So
mm,
various private property rights holders are there's been a great deal of public outcry about this because non-Indigenous people and business owners, et cetera, are concerned about what it means for their private property rights if the underlying title ultimately belongs to an Indigenous nation. And since this ruling, many other Indigenous nations in British Columbia have also initiated legal processes to have their title restored, because in British Columbia, the government, settlers, the government, et cetera, hadn't engaged for the most part in any kind of treaty process. And so the land was never legally surrendered or transferred to the government.
Mm,
So we're seeing, I think, in real time right now, the way that um, reconciliation as a framework of both feeling and public policy didn't quite break through the colonial mentality that private property sort of holds together. And uh, it'll be, you know, both interesting and probably frustrating to see how this all plays out over the next few years. Um, in my opinion, this is sort of, again, another form of historical justice that, the land had been stolen and should be returned to the people from whom it was stolen, and that, Indigenous nations are simply using the legal process that is available to them like every other Canadian. Um, but it does feel, and I talked to some of my colleagues about this, other writers, Indigenous writers, that we are approaching in Canada kind of post reconciliation moment. And that
mm,
even though technically the process is still ongoing in the form of these calls to action, and so the TRC process does have a kind of afterlife, again, in the form
yeah,
of these calls to action, which are meant to, be addressed by the government, regardless of whether it's you know, which part of the spectrum that government is on. Um, and in 2023, this only, I think, there were still the vast majority of the calls to action had not been addressed. There was something like only 14 of the
mm,
95 had been adequately addressed. And I think that number is one or two more since
yeah,
2023 have been addressed. But yeah, for the most part, it does not seem like in uh, that governments, both provincial and federal, will be able to substantively complete these calls to action, and they're completable. That's the thing. It's not like they're impossible.
right.
But so yeah, I think I wanted to mention that to say that um, we are in a somewhat tricky and inchoate moment in Canada post reconciliation, post TRC. And it's difficult to assess, what exactly the state of Indigenous and non-Indigenous, or Indigenous and governmental relations, will be in the immediate future.
Mm,
In part because, conservative right-wing governments and lobbyists and groups are really sort of capitalizing or trying to capitalize on the sort of tension and friction and fear that these court cases have and will continue to produce. Um, and so what does it, so where does sort of queerness come? How does it sort of figure in all of this? Which is just to say that I am concerned that it will continue to be marginalized and
mm,
neglected in the face of what feels like sort of these more immediate issues that need to be addressed, attended to, etc. But my insistence is that it should not be further marginalized or
mm,
neglected, because I mean, even in that one survivor's testimony, like it's just like two paragraphs, a few sentences,
yeah,
but to me, it's so heartbreaking and points to this long legacy that it doesn't feel like we as a community or as a country have been able to adequately contend with. And I think again, creative writing has a part to play in this, but also I think we do need in some way to build out some kind of public record
Mm.
of these experiences, or even just to have these conversations publicly and have recordings of them. I don't know. There needs to be some kind of archival effort on the part
Mm.
of the people, the archivists and whatnot, who are all over the country. I think should have some part to play in ensuring that the queer, trans, two-spirit, indigenous perspective is not further neglected in the sort of what will be the newer and seemingly more pressing challenges of the colonial relationship.
Thank you for those important thoughts. Let me ask you a follow-up question just immediately to
Hmm.
that, because I think this is a very important theme to address also, because in my understanding, this also relates to, so both the queer, trans, indigenous perspectives, but also the land rights
Hmm.
claims. Um, have largely been left outside and excluded from the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And you mentioned sort of how um, at least the land rights claims and now are addressed to a certain extent in court, but also how they become politicized
Yeah,
and maybe also even further rendered vulnerable. Do you think that this is also relating to this kind of politicization of these questions, that this is connected to them not being included in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
I think that there is probably some connection with the ways that historically indigenous issues have been engaged with um, one-dimensionally.
Mm,
Um, Diane Millian has a great, her work generally is great. I'm sure you're aware of it, and she has one, her felt theory essay where she first introduces the concept of felt theory, the emotional knowledge we put to use to make sense of our lives in the world, where she says that, um, Indigenous women had to start writing memoir in the late 20th century in Canada and the US, in part because Indigenous activism took a single issue lens. So
mm,
they sort of mainstream Indigenous activism was chiefly concerned with race and Indigenous peoples as a racialized category, which of course is the case, but uh, because they didn't attend to other markers of identity like gender and class and sexual identity, they weren't, able to fully sort of advocate for their communities and to bring about a more fulsome transformation of everyday life. And so the Indigenous women of this time wrote memoir to attest to their experiences of both racism and patriarchal violence, but inside and outside of our communities.
mm.
So there was the sort of the difficult and challenging work of looking at our own communities as how they manifested, how patriarchy manifested there. Um, and and I think we could see something similar in terms of like a single issue lens or sort of a one-dimensional approach to engaging with indigenous communities. I think that did to an extent take place with the TRC,
Mm.
um, although they were better able to address sort of gender and women's experience, indigenous women and girls' experiences of the system and of colonialism more broadly. Um, yeah, it seems like there's always this tendency or instinct to compartmentalize, and that is an instinct that does so often is to the detriment of queer and trans and two-spirit Indigenous people. And I think again, Alex Wilson is doing some interesting work on like queering our understanding of land-based knowledge and of land-based education. And you know, she's, I think, pushing us to think about our relationship with land as something that is bound up with our gender and sexual identities, not in a way that reinforces sort of more essentialist understandings of those things, but rather to demonstrate their kind of capacious
Mm,
uh, and expansive facets that exceed sort of traditional knowledge. Um, and so I think, we'll continue, we're sort of continuing to figure out how to talk about these things in as complex and multifaceted ways as possible. And, I hope someone is working on something that has to do with queerness and land rights and land claims, because I do think that that's like a rich uh, place for thinking and theorizing.
definitely. Thank you very much. And there is definitely a lot of potential work to be done in that regard, I think, and in these questions are really so pertinent in many ways. Um, what do you think that students and scholars, and also more the general public, can learn from the Canadian experiences? So the experiences with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but also the aftermath. When we think about justice and imagine justice in other settler contexts, such as the Nordic countries.
Yeah. Well, I think, beneficially there is this sort of large archive, this large sort of digital record that can be engaged with. And it is all sort of public access. All these reports and the 5 volumes of the TRC commissions are all sort of freely available to anyone on the internet. Because I think not only are those volumes like really meticulous and um, grounded in the sort of work of Indigenous thinkers and activists that had been taking place for decades. Um, they also, again, can be instructive in their omissions, and they can demonstrate, I think, in other contexts, um, what kind of language is or sort of appeals to or makes sense to a larger public that's not immersed in these questions and or does not share the lived experience of the Indigenous
Mm,
people. Uh, and I think that maybe there's something to be learned also from like the amount of writing, both academic and non-academic, by Indigenous people in Canada about the failures of reconciliation in our country.
mm,
And you know what it yeah what I'm sure there's a lot that can be gleaned from that body of work. I'm thinking, there's obviously like Glenn Coulthard's book, which was came out sort of in the midst of all of this of the TRC process, and kind of sort of set set a tone, so to speak, that was in contradistinction to the tone of the TRC more broadly.
mm,
But others, like, others who have said that reconciliation has felt like a kind of politics of distraction, Jeff Corntassel, or who others who have felt that it was like a PR stunt, so to speak. that helped Canada sort of refashion its image both domestically and internationally. Um, and also others have pointed out that the TRC, and you mentioned this to Daniela already, that there was no sort of substantial engagement with land claims or land rights, and
No.
that there's nothing, there's sort of the repatriation of land to Indigenous peoples was not a component of the TRC. And that seemed like to many Indigenous activists and thinkers a sort of grave error. Um, and yeah, I think in other contexts, like the Nordic context, where as far as I understand, land claims and land rights are still very much sort of difficult to
Hmm.
attend
Yes.
to and to talk about.
Yes.
Um, that there might be something to learn from
Mm.
our context.
Thank you. Yes, that's definitely true. And uh, land and water rights are among the most sort of pressing political concerns. Also, the many of the litigation processes concern land and water rights, and these have generally been, let's say, they have played a minor role in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's thus far, but of course we still continue to see the final report on the Swedish Truth Commission has not been
Yeah,
published, for example. So the responses of the governments are still sort of unfolding. So um, but it seems also that land rights are, well, that's a part of a larger trend also, that land rights are difficult to address, and seems to be questions that where the states, the settler states, also really do not want to, um, they do not necessarily want to further these questions.
yeah.
But thinking about um, you talked about the failures of the Canadian TRC, and I think that's very interesting that we can probably learn from and what has been considered as the failures. You
Hmm.
also mentioned that quite few of these calls for action have been actually followed up on, or you said that there were, was it 14 out of 94 or something like this has been
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
have materialized. Um, so what would you say on the question of whether the Canadian TRC process has succeeded or failed in the reconciliation process? And is it even meaningful to talk about success or failure in this way?
I think that, so I mentioned the Yellowhead Institute, which is based out of Toronto Metropolitan University. They are undertaking the work of tracking the government's response to these calls to action. And I think that's really important work they're doing it publicly. And I believe every year or so they publish an update, or every other year they publish an update. And that's important because it does allow us to talk about failure and success,
Mm,
and it gives us data to be able to do that. And I think that was one of the sort of incredibly important and intelligent aspects of the TRC Commission, that they put forward these calls to action as a kind of living document that could be used to hold the government accountable. Um, Again, I just wish there would be like we could have expanded on them. There's still the 94. It seems like a lot, but there could have been more. Um, and I think that if we look at the sort of qualitative and quantitative data about like Indigenous peoples' well-being and like socioeconomic status, et cetera, and so forth, that we'll see that like the life, like the everyday life quality of Indigenous people in Canada um, has not substantially transformed
Mm.
post post TRC, post 2015 final report, and that there are still um, funding shortfalls that are really circumscribing First Nations communities. And uh, while some have sort of benefited from various court cases and disputes that are being settled now about various matters, uh, that these sort of brief windfalls also aren't really transforming the quality of life of Indigenous peoples. And I think there's an occasion for a global conversation to be had about, what what policy changes do have been successful in transforming the quality of life of Indigenous people. Um, you know, for me, ultimately, I want Indigenous people to suffer less, and I want us to live longer. The stats still in Canada paint a portrait of premature death. Like we're still dying earlier, and often cases in preventable reasons for preventable reasons. Our incarceration rates are still incredibly high relative to the rest of the country. Our poverty rates of illness, et cetera, incredibly high, way out of proportion. What does it take to actually uh, address and mitigate these issues at a large scale? I think is a conversation that can be had in other contexts. Um, because yeah, I think unfortunately, as far as I could tell, the TRC, did not actually. It might have made some sort of minor changes and uh, improvements, but overall, in terms of Indigenous quality of life, we're still engaging with a lot of the same issues we were pre-TRC.
Thank you very much for these important thoughts. And we have now come to the end of this session. So thank you very much for sharing your reflections and thoughts, giving these examples from your work and from the work of others. Um, and I think that we have all learned a lot. Thank you very much for being with us here today, Dr. Belcourt.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Really important conversation and great questions.